Imagine building a company worth $24 billion that, for the most part, doesn't actually exist. Allow me to introduce Wirecard, perhaps the most audacious financial fraud of the 21st century. While investors celebrated this German tech success story, behind the scenes, $1.9 billion in cash simply didn't exist. By the time authorities caught on, Jan Marsalek, Wirecard's charismatic COO, had vanished without a trace. But how did a payment processor handling money from porn and gambling sites transform into Germany's most spectacular corporate fraud? The answer involves spies, threats against journalists, and a house of Wirecards that took 20 years to collapse. The perfect front. How Wirecard built its reputation. In 1999, e-commerce as a concept was fast growing as a convenient and safe way to pay for online services. It filled a need. Trying to pay without it back in 1999, before banking apps and the like, would have been a pain. Firstly, it would have taken weeks, the process itself involving potentially having to visit a bank branch in person with payment details. With an e-commerce service, after some initial setup, everything could be done online. Companies like eBay and PayPal were a triumph and grew quickly and were widely adopted. But there were certain sections of the online world that couldn't. The payment companies simply refused to even go near them, fearing tarnishing their reputations. I'm talking about pornography and gambling sites, who lagged behind while less taboo businesses marched forth, until one company took the plunge into the taboo niche. Wirecard. It's not the origin story you might have expected for the eventual billion-dollar giant, but it certainly might explain its eventual scandal and collapse. The company's early days were notable, but for the most part, entirely legitimate and fraud-free. They facilitated e-commerce just like any other service, with the only difference being the clientele. That was until the early 2000s, when Wirecard began to transform into what we eventually knew in 2020. CEO Markus Braun joined in 2002 and came in with a grand vision for more. Under his direction, the company worked to shed its unsavory beginnings. Braun, with his Steve Jobs-inspired black turtlenecks and tech visionary persona, positioned himself as Germany's answer to Silicon Valley brilliance. Wirecard transforming from taboo niche to his stepping stone to greatness. He spoke of digital financial ecosystems and fintech revolutions, carefully distancing the company from its past. By 2005, Wirecard had acquired a German banking license by way of a few mergers and acquisitions of small pre-existing banks, a strategic move that legitimized their operations and opened doors previously closed to them. Keep this strategy in mind, because you'll be hearing about it a lot. That being to find vulnerable targets with valuable licenses, absorb them quickly, and leverage their regulatory approvals to expand operations. What followed was one of the most remarkable corporate ascensions in European financial history. Between 2008 and 2018, Wirecard's stock price climbed a staggering 1,800%, with market analysts enthusiastically recommending the stock. Here was Germany's tech champion, a homegrown success story in a country that had long envied America's digital dominance. Wirecard's executive team expertly fed the German desire for a technology success story. Acquisitions across Asia generated headlines about German ingenuity conquering new markets. Quarterly reports showed double-digit growth that seemed to validate the company's ambitious global strategy. By 2016, Wirecard's market value surpassed that of Commerzbank, one of Germany's oldest financial institutions. German business publications ran glowing profiles of Braun, portraying him as a visionary who understood the digital future while traditional bankers remained stuck in the past. The coronation came in September 2018 when Wirecard entered Germany's prestigious DAX index, replacing Commerzbank. The DAX represents Germany's 30 most valuable companies, the crown jewels of Europe's largest economy. For a payment processor with obscure beginnings to join the ranks of Volkswagen, Siemens, and BMW represented extraordinary validation. At its peak, Wirecard was valued at 24 billion euros. But this is a channel about crimes, not about business success stories. This rise and celebrity was no more than a facade, supported by scaffolding of toothpicks and tape. The question wasn't if it collapsed, but when. Behind the facade. When we called Braun a Steve Jobs lookalike, we touched upon something very important. He was a very aesthetics-oriented person. Wirecard was growing, but not as fast as it looked. Wirecard operated in a dichotomy. There was the first business of providing banking and payment services. That was for the customers and was legitimate. The other was increasing growth and profits. That was for the shareholders. That was not legitimate, and where Braun's talent for aesthetics came into play. Beneath the dazzling facade of Wirecard's success lay a company that could not survive without manufacturing billions in fake revenue as a show for investors. The financial illusion was an intricate machine with moving parts spread across continents, designed to create money from nothing, while leaving virtually no trace behind. At its core, Wirecard faced a fundamental problem that no amount of charismatic leadership could solve. Its legitimate operations simply weren't profitable enough to justify its soaring valuation. The company's actual payment processing business struggled to generate meaningful returns, creating relentless pressure to inflate revenue figures. To solve this existential problem, COO Jan Marsalek, who came on in 2010, and his team engineered an elaborate network of third-party acquirers, TPAs, supposedly independent companies processing payments in regions where Wirecard couldn't operate directly. This added more steps that any investigator would have to take to uncover the truth. These TPAs became perfect vehicles for financial sleight of hand, strategically positioned in jurisdictions with minimal regulatory oversight where transactions could disappear into a paperwork void. The TPAs were frequently shell companies, often controlled by associates of Jan Marsalek, who generated fake contracts and revenue reports to inflate Wirecard's financial performance. They literally created money from thin air here, reporting profits to everyone from businesses in places like the Middle East and the Philippines when they never actually had any users there. But what made this scheme effective was how the TPAs allowed Wirecard to bypass normal financial controls meant to prevent this sort of thing. By routing payments through these entities, the company circumvented licensing requirements and obscured both the origins and destinations of funds. The fraud's ingenuity culminated in a round-trip transaction system. Like water in a closed pipe system, money would leave Wirecard, pass through a labyrinth of shell companies, and return, disguised as revenue, from non-existent customers. A preliminary investigation by law firm Raja and Tan pointed to, quote, several years of book padding across Wirecard's Asian operations, end quote, with evidence suggesting that Wirecard's Munich headquarters was at least partially aware of these activities. The infamous trust accounts represented the pinnacle of this deception, where the now notorious 1.9 billion euros was supposedly being held safe. Complete with expertly forged bank statements, these accounts were presented to auditors as proof of Wirecard's financial stability. When EY finally insisted on direct confirmation from the Philippine banks supposedly holding these funds, the entire house of cards collapsed, with the bank's simple declaration, the money had never existed. The silencers, spies, threats, and intimidation. When phantom billions need protection, companies don't just hire lawyers, they build armies. The Financial Times began pulling at Wirecard's loose threads in 2015 through a series of investigative reports titled The House of Wirecard. Lead reporter Dan McCrum noticed troubling inconsistencies in the company's financial statements, triggering what would become a 5-year battle between journalism and corporate intimidation. Wirecard, instead of addressing the mounting questions about their financial statements, launched a counteroffensive that crossed well beyond normal corporate defense boundaries by hiring Rami al-Obeidi, a former head of Libyan foreign intelligence, specifically to conduct surveillance operations against those threatening to expose the fraud. Al-Obeidi's team deployed calculated psychological warfare against journalists. Financial Times reporters endured threatening late-night phone calls, discovered they were being followed during commutes and investigations, and found their emails and communications compromised. Quote, "We faced something that went far beyond normal corporate pushback," end quote, Dan McCrum later revealed. As the lead reporter investigating Wirecard's finances, he became their primary target, facing elaborate sting operations designed to completely discredit him. The operatives crafted fake job offers to entrap him, dangled potential bribes, and worked tirelessly to catch him in compromising situations that could destroy both his reputation and the Financial Times' investigation. This sophisticated surveillance campaign targeted not just journalists, but also short sellers and financial researchers, anyone who might piece together the truth about Wirecard's phantom billions. Wirecard simultaneously weaponized German national pride, positioning themselves as a German success story under foreign attack. The Financial Times was British, after all. Critics were portrayed as outsiders trying to undermine Germany's financial prowess globally. This manipulation of patriotism created a protective shield, making criticism of Wirecard feel almost treacherous to many Germans who had celebrated the company's apparent success. Germany's financial regulator, BaFin, became an unwitting ally in Wirecard's defense strategy. Rather than investigating the mounting evidence against Wirecard, BaFin launched an investigation into the Financial Times for alleged market manipulation. Al-Obeidy's most audacious move came when he presented evidence claiming the Financial Times had colluded with short sellers, a serious accusation that could have destroyed the newspaper's credibility. Though the Financial Times ultimately cleared itself through an external law firm investigation, the damage to public perception had already been done, buying Wirecard precious time to continue its fraudulent operations. The whistleblowers. Truth against all odds. For every whistleblower who steps forward against a multi-billion-dollar giant like Wirecard, the calculation is brutally simple. Is the truth worth risking everything for? For Pav Gill, Wirecard's senior legal counsel in the Asia-Pacific region, that answer was thankfully yes. Despite having no background as an activist or corporate crusader, this ordinary employee found himself at an extraordinary crossroads when he witnessed the manipulation of financial statements firsthand. As the company's own legal representative, he had front-row seats to how internal investigations into suspicious activities were systematically suppressed, particularly through Wirecard's Asian operations, which would later prove to be the epicenter of the fraud. The psychological burden became unbearable each morning as he arrived at work, knowing what lurked behind the polished corporate presentations. For Gill, remaining silent became morally impossible. Each night he'd return home, the weight of complicity growing heavier, until the moment he decided the truth demanded action, regardless of personal cost. The documents these insiders provided to the Financial Times painted a devastating picture that contradicted everything Wirecard claimed to be. Internal files revealed the industrial-scale production of financial fiction, forged contracts created out of thin air, transactions backdated to inflate quarterly profits, and suspicious money flows designed to create the illusion of a thriving global business. These were receipts, timestamps, and signatures from an irrefutable paper trail. Finally, the tides turned in favor of truth and justice. January 2019 marked the first seismic crack in Wirecard's carefully constructed facade. After years of preliminary investigation, the Financial Times published concrete evidence that Wirecard staff in Singapore were systematically creating backdated contracts to inflate the company's profits. This was documented proof of fraud happening in real time, with specific employees implicated in the scheme. This moment represented the turning point. After years of Wirecard dismissing critics as conspirators and market manipulators, here was something they couldn't simply wave away with intimidation. Evidence. But old habits die hard, and the crusade against the Financial Times continued. The more specific the evidence became, the more aggressively Wirecard attacked those presenting it. As pressure mounted, Wirecard's board commissioned KPMG to conduct a special audit in October 2019, a move designed to project confidence, but that ultimately accelerated their downfall. What should have been a straightforward verification process became a masterclass in obstruction. KPMG auditors found themselves stonewalled, denied access to crucial documents, and prevented from speaking with key third-party partners. The resulting audit, which eventually came into being, was devastating precisely because of what it couldn't find. After months of investigation, KPMG was forced to admit they simply could not verify the majority of Wirecard's profits from 2016 to 2018. They cited significant obstacles to their work, a polite way of saying Wirecard was hiding something massive. Most damning of all, KPMG couldn't confirm the existence of a 1.9 billion euros supposedly held in trust accounts, money that, as the world would soon discover, never existed at all. For the Financial Times journalists who had pursued this story for years, the KPMG report vindicated an extraordinarily difficult and dangerous investigation. Dan McCrum and his colleagues had endured surveillance operations directed by former intelligence operatives, hacking attempts, and intimidation tactics designed to silence them permanently. When the KPMG report finally arrived in April 2020, it made it impossible for investors, regulators, and the public to continue believing Wirecard's lies. The company that had spent years attacking its critics now found itself unable to explain why a supposedly independent audit couldn't verify its most basic financial claims. The collapse, when the Wirecards came tumbling down. That 5-alarm fire wasn't just signaling the end, it is about to trigger a financial freefall unprecedented in European corporate history. After years of reassurances and aggressive deflection, Wirecard had reached the moment of reckoning that no amount of intimidation could prevent. The company that had spent years playing an elaborate shell game was about to be forced to show its empty hands. Behind closed doors, EY auditors had finally done what critics had been demanding for years. They directly contacted the Philippine banks where Wirecard claimed to hold 1.9 billion euros in trust accounts. The response shattered the carefully constructed illusion. Representatives from BDO Unibank and Bank of the Philippine Islands delivered devastating news. They had no relationship at all with Wirecard. The documents purporting to show these massive cash reserves were forgeries, containing obvious errors no legitimate banker would make. On June 18, 2020, the moment of truth arrived. Wirecard admitted that 1.9 billion euros, a quarter of its entire balance sheet, simply didn't exist. The market reaction was swift and brutal. Wirecard's stock plummeted 62% in a single day, vaporizing 10 billion euros in market value. Investors who once celebrated the fintech darling now raced for the exits. Marcus Braun, who had styled himself as Germany's Steve Jobs, resigned as CEO the very next day. 3 days later, Braun found himself arrested by Munich prosecutors on suspicion of falsifying accounts and market manipulation. The executive who once lectured skeptics about financial innovation now faced interrogation about what would become Europe's most spectacular accounting fraud. The collapse accelerated with stunning speed. On June 25th, exactly 1 week after admitting the missing billions didn't exist, Wirecard filed for insolvency. The filing revealed debts of nearly 4 billion euros, obligations to creditors who would likely recover mere pennies on the euro. In just 7 days, Wirecard transformed from a DAX-listed technology giant to a cautionary tale. The company that had boasted about revolutionary payment systems couldn't pay its own bills. German regulators who had defended Wirecard against foreign attackers faced uncomfortable questions about their judgment. BaFin, the financial watchdog that had banned short-selling of Wirecard's stock and investigated journalists rather than the company, scrambled to explain its actions. The regulator had positioned itself as Wirecard's protector, only to be exposed as either dangerously incompetent or willfully blind. For Wirecard's 5,800 employees, the collapse meant shattered careers and uncertain futures. Many had believed they were working for a legitimate tech innovator, only to discover their employer's core business was fabrication rather than facilitation. Shareholders saw entire retirement investments evaporate. Owners of pension funds that had allocated millions watched helplessly as those allocations became essentially worthless. The human cost extended beyond financial losses. Former employees described the shock of discovering that years of their professional lives had been dedicated to a company built on fraud. Some had defended Wirecard against critics, genuinely believing the accusations were baseless attacks. Now they grappled with questions about their unwitting complicity in a massive deception. The fugitive, Jan Marsalek's mysterious disappearance. As Wirecard employees processed their unwitting role in the fraud, the man who likely knew every detail of the deception was already implementing his escape plan. Within hours of the company admitting its missing billions didn't exist, Jan Marsalek, the operational mastermind behind the scheme, vanished with the same meticulous precision he had applied to maintaining Wirecard's house of cards for years. The timing was impeccable. On June 18, 2020, as Wirecard publicly confessed that 1.9 billion euros was missing from its accounts, Marsalek was being terminated from his position. But unlike his colleagues who would face the music in the coming days, Marsalek had no intention of answering difficult questions. Instead, he set in motion a disappearing act worthy of a master strategist. His final known movements in Germany revealed calculated foresight. He told associates he was heading to the Philippines to track down the missing money, a misdirection that brought him precious time. This was the execution of a contingency plan years in the making. The breadcrumbs led not to Southeast Asia, but eastward. Intelligence sources have pieced together evidence suggesting Russian intelligence services facilitated his extraction. Private aircraft reportedly transported him first to Belarus, then across the border into Russia, the first move in his elaborate escape. But what makes this vanishing act particularly startling is how it revealed Marsalek's true nature. The full extent of this nature emerged only after his disappearance. Marsalek reportedly has access to Russian nerve agent formulas and was involved with Russian mercenaries in Libya, allegedly helping orchestrate deployments. These weren't ordinary business relationships, but deep ties to Russian intelligence, connections that ultimately provided his escape route when his corporate life imploded. The manhunt continues, with Interpol red notices and European arrest warrants. But these mechanisms prove ineffective against a fugitive with state-level protection. Law enforcement confronts the reality that the orchestrator of Europe's largest recent financial fraud may never face justice. Conclusion. As the dust settles on the Wirecard saga, we find ourselves with protagonists, the Financial Times and whistleblowers, and antagonists, Braun and Marsalek. But we also have a few more players who are neither. The first is the German public, blinded by pride. The second is the politicians who are elected by the people and thus bent to their views as well. But the biggest non-aligned player here, who is closest to the antagonist's side, as useful fools, are the enforcers of laws and financial oversight institutions like BaFin, who failed entirely.